Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel and welcome back to the latest episode in Talking History. And today we'll have a very special guest on. We'll have Alison Martin. Alison Martin is a historian, particularly on the revolutionary period in 1916-1923. She got her undergraduate degree at Queen's in History and Theology in 2011, and she also got her master's at the same institution. She's written prominently a lot of articles that's been shared in places like History Ireland and Shola, and also published a lot more articles on various unknown figures relatively unknown regarding the revolutionary period. Today, she's going to be giving a talk on, as you can see here, the treaty forgotten Michael Collins on. I'm actually really looking forward to this. I've been excited so far. And I just want to thank Alison for being with us today. So thanks very much, Alison. And without any further ado, I'll pass everything over to you. Thanks so much, Alison.
Okay, well, thanks for that introduction, Peter. And yeah, I'd like to thank Peter for the opportunity to give this talk. I've had it under wraps for a while, so I'm really looking forward to present it now. So yeah, as Peter said, today I'm going to be sharing a little presentation on the treaty. It's a film I've tentatively named the Forgotten Michael Collins film. So those with a keen interest in Irish history may be familiar with it. It's fair to say, I think, that the 1996 Michael Collins film, which was directed by Neil Jordan, is more widely known, certainly by the public. But I just think that this film is maybe forgotten in some circles, so it's really interesting to have a deeper look at it. So this presentation, it's actually based on a shorter article I wrote for Ireland's Own magazine back in 2018. But since then, I've had some further thoughts on the topic. And I've also talked to a lot of people about it online, and I do know there's others out there interested in it too. So I thought it was a good time maybe to revisit this film and consider its significance now. So yeah, just on the first slide here on the left, I've included some images from RTE archives from the film, and on the right, it's the promotional poster for it. In terms of the presentation structure, just before I begin, I recognise not everyone may be well versed in this chapter of Irish history. Like, everyone has their specialisms or their particular interest. So I'm going to begin by giving a brief historical background to help set the stage a bit. So I'm going to be looking at what was the Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1921. How did the idea for the treaty film come about? What was the political context at the time of the film's release in 1991? I'm then going to introduce the cast of the film, offering a brief look at the key actors before transitioning into a summary, a brief summary of the film itself. And finally, I'm going to present an analysis of the film. So to do this, I'm going to be looking at reviews, potential criticisms, and possible comparisons to the 1996 Michael Collins film. So the film opens in 1919, at a time when the Irish War of Independence was already underway. January of that year marked two pivotal events that occurred simultaneously. On the 21st of January, Dáil Éireann met for the first time at the Mansion House in Dublin. So this was the newly formed Parliament of the Irish Republic, established by Sinn Féin TDs who'd won a majority in the December 1918 general election. So at this meeting, 4 key documents were read out and adopted: a constitution, a declaration of independence, a democratic programme, and a message to the free nations of the world. That same day, the first shots of the Irish War of Independence were fired at Soloheadbeg, County Tipperary, where 2 RIC constables were killed by IRA volunteers. So if you're looking for a clearer definition of the War of Independence, historian John Dorney offers a useful one. He described it as a guerrilla conflict between the British state and its forces in Ireland, and Irish Republican guerrillas and the Irish Volunteers or Irish Republican Army. So if you're interested in looking into a more comprehensive overview of this conflict, Michael Hopkinson's Irish War of Independence is also highly recommended. And there's also lots of other valuable works out there on the War of Independence if you want to look more into the background of this for the film. So the truce of July 1921 brought an end to the War of Independence, and it was followed by a series of 4 meetings. as well as correspondence between the British Prime Minister David Lloyd George and Eamon de Valera, who was president of Dáil Éireann. So this was aimed at establishing the basis for formal peace negotiations. On the 30th of September, de Valera accepted Lloyd George's invitation to send a team of Irish negotiators, a team to London. So the negotiations took place there in London between the 11th of October and the 6th of December 1921. And these talks culminated in the signing of the Anglo-Irish Treaty. So this treaty was obviously a very important document. I'm not going to go over all the stipulations in it, but again, it's something that's very interesting to look into. But just to go over the main points, the treaty allowed for the creation of the Irish Free State, a 26-county dominion within the British Empire. So the Irish Free State would be similar to Canada or New Zealand. One of the major points of contention in the debates, of course, was the oath of allegiance. So members of the Free State Parliament had to take an oath of allegiance to the Free State Constitution and then an oath of fealty to the King. The treaty also stipulated that a boundary commission would be set up to decide the exact location of the border between Northern Ireland and the Irish Free State. But Northern Ireland had the right to opt out of the new Free State, which it did in December 1922. So essentially, while the Free State would not be a fully independent republic, which is what some people had hoped for, it did gain a level of autonomy that went beyond anything offered under the previous Home Rule proposals. And the treaty also included lots of other important clauses on trade, on defence, financial obligations, the treaty ports, as well as other stipulations on that. So it's worth exploring those if you're interested. And a good place to look for an overview of that treaty there is documents on Irish foreign policy. It gives you all the key stipulations, because I think it's important to understand this context for the film. Also, just to say, I think it's quite often a misconception that the treaty partitioned Ireland. In fact, the Government of Ireland Act, which had been passed in 1920, and it came into effect in 1921, it had partitioned Ireland, creating two Home Rule states of Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland. So just wanted to highlight that, because sometimes that can be get confusing. So how did the idea for the treaty film come about? So it was Roger Bowden, who we see his picture here on the left, an experienced TV producer with a proven record of dealing with Irish issues, who originally came up with the idea of making a programme or a film about the negotiations that led to the signing of the treaty. Bowden later stated he'd originally wanted to make a drama, but he was prepared to fall back on documentary. The director, Jonathan Lewis, who we see in the middle, on the other hand, he claimed he'd initially been approached by Bowden to make a documentary. However, due to the lack of archive film footage that was available, and also because of the lack of surviving participants, he came up with the idea of wanting to turn it into a drama. So after a period of research had been undertaken, the Irish writer Brian Fallon was commissioned to write the screenplay. And in writing the screenplay, Fallon attempted to be as historically accurate as possible. Overall, it is seen to be a pretty accurate film. I'm going to go more into details later, but the majority of the dialogue and scenes depicting the negotiations was taken directly from the written records. Moreover, several writers and scholars, including Tim Coogan, Roy Foster, and Lord Longford, were hired as historical advisors whilst they were making this. So Roy Foster is a well-known historian. So many people have heard of their interest in Irish history. Again, Tim Coogan, many people have heard of, a journalist and writer. Coogan's written a lot about Michael Collins, including a biography that was released in 1990. And again, at this time, there was sort of a bit of a resurgence of interest in Collins, just as this film was coming out. And then Lord Longford, who authored or co-authored a biography of de Valera, which had been published in 1970. Naturally, however, Fallon also had to exercise a certain amount of creative license, as people usually do with films. And as the treaty was a co-production between RTE and Thames Television, It was scheduled to be shown on RT in December 1991, and then it was going to be repeated on ITV in January 1992. So the initial broadcast was designed specifically to coincide with the 70th anniversary of the signing of the treaty. So what was the political context then in 1991 at the time when the film was first aired? So I think this is important to consider. So in 1991, the Troubles, the conflict in Northern Ireland remained deeply entrenched. This year was marked by ongoing violence between Republican and Loyalist paramilitary groups, alongside frequent clashes with British security forces. So just to pick out a few examples in this period, in January, the IRA carried out a series of incendiary bomb attacks on shops in Belfast, which caused significant property damage. Just weeks later in February, the IRA launched a mortar attack on 10 Downing Street, whilst the British cabinet was in session. And though no injuries occurred, the incident, it gained a lot of publicity and it drew media attention. Loyalist paramilitaries also escalated their campaign. And in March, the Ulster Volunteer Force, UVF, conducted a gun attack on a public house in Capler, County Tyrone. And that was just one of several violent incidents that year. Amidst this backdrop of unrest, political efforts to break the deadlock were also beginning to stir. From April 1991 to November 1992, there was a series of negotiations unfolding involving the British and Irish governments and representatives from 4 of Northern Ireland's main political parties. So director Jonathan Lewis, he noted that the treaty was strikingly relevant given the renewed challenges facing political dialogue between Ireland and Britain. So its themes of compromise, legitimacy, and the delicate art really of negotiation, it probably would have resonated with viewers at that particular time it was released. Also, unbeknownst to the public at the time, there was also secret negotiations taking place between the political party Sinn Féin and the British government. So these covert contacts initiated through back-channel intermediaries would prove pivotal in shaping the peace process. Yet in 1991, to the public, the idea of Sinn Féin representatives being welcomed at Downing Street, it was still considered really to be politically impossible, very unlikely. And this public disbelief was captured in a promotional quote for the treaty film, which was featured in the TV Times in 1991. So the quote read, "Sinn Féin in direct talks at Downing Street with the British Prime Minister, ? Impossible." But then it says it actually happened 70 years ago. So ironically, there's a scene in the film when the British Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, asks, they're considering which Irish political figures were deemed acceptable for the British government to host at Downing Street. Would it be Michael Collins or Dee Lara? And this question, which was being posed in 1921, in some ways echoed the dilemma facing the British government in 1991. Because it was the dilemma of who could they be seen to negotiate with, and who must remain outside the negotiating room because of the potential public reaction. In terms of the cast for the film, the majority of the cast, about 90%, were Irish actors and actresses. So on the right here, Brendan Gleeson, and he's a very famous actor now. Many people will have seen him in a lot of films. He took on the role of Michael Collins, giving a performance which would later win him the Jacobs Award for Best Actor in a TV series. So who was Irish revolutionary Michael Collins? For those that don't know the background, perhaps. Collins was born in Cork in 1890. At the age of 15, he moved to London to work as a clerk. So actually spent a lot of time in London in his youth as a young adult. He joined the IRB, Irish Republican Brotherhood in London, and the Irish Volunteers then in 1914. He returned to Ireland in January 1916, and he famously took part in the Easter Rising. By 1919, he held a couple of positions, Director of Intelligence of the Irish Volunteers. He was also Dáil Minister for Finance, and he was President of the IRB's Supreme Council. So a lot of this film focuses on him. He's the main character. And interestingly, Brendan Gleeson had been a teacher. He'd only recently gone into acting full time in the early 90s. So this was one of his first more prominent roles on TV. He'd done just one film the year before that failed. But obviously now he's much better known as an actor. But yeah, this was really at the start of his career. The cast also includes Julian Fellows, who was the creator of Downton Abbey. People might know him from that. He played Winston Churchill, who was the Secretary of State for the colonies at that time. The film also stars Ian Bannon as British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, Barry McGovern as Eamon de Valera. De Valera was president of Dáil Éireann at that time. Again, another very famous figure in Irish history. We also have Tony Doyle played Arthur Griffith. There's just some more shots from the film. Arthur Griffith was Dáil Éireann's Minister for Foreign Affairs, and he was the leader of the negotiations. So we see him here in the middle picture. There was also other significant figures portrayed in the film, including Robert Barton, the Irish Minister for Economic Affairs, Eamon Duggan and George Gavin Duffy, who were lawyer TDs. There's also other characters portrayed in the film on the British side, maybe briefly, but Field Marshal Sir Henry Wilson is portrayed, Lord Birkenhead, the Lord Chancellor is portrayed during the later negotiations anyway. So I just want to provide a brief summary of the film. Not going to go into all the details, but just a brief summary before I can present a bit of an analysis. So the opening scene, it depicts Collins in a business suit cycling through Dublin, cycling through the streets in 1919. And this is pretty early on in the War of Independence. So he's delivering an order to have an inspector and his bodyguard assassinated. And he says this is before they do us any more damage. In the following scene, we see Collins using his kind of characteristic trick of getting past an army checkpoint by confidently approaching the unsuspecting British officer and offering him a cigarette. So he's hiding in plain sight, basically. And Collins' effectiveness is emphasised when Sir Henry Wilson informs the British Prime Minister, Lloyd George, that Collins is destroying our intelligence networks. You really get a sense of his skill here. As the War of Independence escalates, both sides become war weary, and a truce is eventually declared in the War of Independence. Unlike Neil Jordan's Michael Collins film, the treaty actually depicts some of the preliminary negotiations between de Valera and Lloyd George. So we see this scene here on the right, which is again, it's something it's maybe not really depicted really traditionally in films. What Lloyd George was offering at this point was essentially Dominion status for the 26 counties. But as we see in the film, de Valera remained adamant that the people of Ireland wanted a republic. Dominion wasn't enough. When the negotiations collapsed, de Valera persuades a reluctant Collins to accompany the Irish delegation to London in order to negotiate a peace settlement with the British. Interestingly, in the film, Collins is initially depicted as eager to travel to London in July 1921 to negotiate with Lloyd George. However, by October, he hesitates, fearing that the increased exposure would strip him of his mistake. He would no longer be the elusive Pimpernel, is basically how he puts it. Dáil President Eamon de Valera famously didn't attend the treaty negotiations in London, and that this has been a point of a lot of debate. But his reasoning, as dramatised in the film, is that it would be a better tactic to remain at home, and he emphasises his role in the film as a symbol of the Republic. The final third of the film, it depicts scenes from some of the key meetings held between the British and Irish delegations in the autumn of 1921. So just on the right, I've included an image of the actual British and Irish delegations and the team members. I just thought it's worth thinking about it again, connected to the historical context. But it's worth noting that some of the individuals featured played more behind the scenes roles in the negotiation. But and on the left we have how it's depicted in the film. But one of the main issues being discussed was the relationship between a prospective Irish state and the British Empire. For the British, membership of the Empire and recognition of the Crown were crucial, with naval defence, trade and finance being the other key issues. But for the Irish, sovereignty and Irish unity were the critical issues. And as I mentioned before, the oath of allegiance, it was also a major sticking point. The Irish delegation were under considerable pressure, although they were skilled. The British team, had much more diplomatic experience. I think the film emphasised the strain, particularly on Arthur Griffith, who was leading the Irish delegation, as well as Collins. So there's pressure on them to sign an agreement. Pressure from the British side. We also see some of the individual negotiations between Collins and Lloyd George, as well as between Birkenhead, for example, and Collins. Towards the end of the negotiations, Lloyd George, who's played brilliantly by Ian Bannon, he dramatically presents two letters, one containing the treaty articles of agreement and the other stating that the Sinn Féin representatives have rejected the oath of allegiance and refused to join the Empire. So he kind of threatens that if he sends the second letter to James Craig, who's Northern Ireland's Prime Minister, that it's going to mean war within 3 days. So eventually we see the Irish delegation, the different members kind of trying to think of all sides here, but about their options. But eventually, given the prospect of return to war, Collins and other delegates agreed to sign the treaty, thus agreeing to 26-county Irish Free State. So rather than ending with Michael Collins' assassination, the final scene depicts Collins shaking hands with Lord Birkenhead, whilst making the now famous declaration that he has signed his actual death warrant. Just before the credits, photographs of the significant figures depicted in the narrative who died within a year of the signing of the treaty are juxtaposed with shots of the actors playing each character. For example, British Field Marshal Sir Henry Wilson, it tells us he was shot dead on Collins' orders in June 1922 in London. Arthur Griffith, we're told, died of a heart attack. His death was, in fact, certified as a brain hemorrhage, but many scholars have pointed to the strain that the treaty negotiations took on him and his health. We're told Michael Collins was shot dead by anti-treaty forces in August 1922. The final shot, which we see on the left, is of De Valera, along with the caption, he eventually took the oath of allegiance and he held high office for 50 years. And he died at age 92. So whilst this overview shows the tragedy of the split caused by the treaty and the Civil War, it's kind of making that judgment. One could argue that De Valera perhaps maybe came out of it the best, potentially. The epilogue tells us the treaty was ratified in Dublin. The 26 counties of Ireland became the Irish Free State. The boundary of Northern Ireland was never altered. And it tells us, as they put it, De Valera and the die-hard Republicans rejected the treaty, and Ireland was devastated by the Civil War that followed. So that this is how it ends. And obviously the Civil War is a very tragic chapter in Ireland's history. So that's the film, but I just wanted to look at now, what did the critics think? How was the film received? What did the public think? In the days after its initial transmission, critics' reviews of the treaty were generally favourable. Obviously, it's important to look at reviews from both the Irish and British point of view. The Sunday Business Post, which was an Irish paper, it described it as near perfection. And even in Britain, where there would have been considerably less interest in Irish affairs, the treaty managed to reach a respectable 5.3 million viewers. The show was granted a peak midweek evening slot on ITV. Nevertheless, these viewing figures were still impressive, considering that a documentary series about Winston Churchill had been launched over on the BBC during the same time slot. So yeah, given that it still fared pretty well. This is just a feature on the treaty, which was published in the Times in January 1992, and I think it just gives you a bit of an idea of, you know, there would have been some publicity surrounding it in the papers and in the TV Times. So it's fair to say the film has many positive qualities. In terms of the positive aspects, I would feel that there are attempts to show both political sides and viewpoints. The film conveys a strong sense of war weariness. So one point in the film towards the end of the War of Independence, when Collins is asked for a military assessment, he says that the IRA are down to counting bullets. But British casualties are also acknowledged. There's a scene when De Valera is talking to a British colonel, and he sees the coffin of a fallen British soldier being carried into a chapel. Additionally, the film highlights the precarious position of Lloyd George, who was a Liberal Prime Minister at the head of a coalition which was dominated by the Conservative Party. So I think it shows kind of the British side's kind of precarious political positioning. For me, I also think it's interesting that the film underscores the intense media interest surrounding Collins. And in that regard, it complements an article that I actually wrote for History Ireland a few years ago. And that article was about how Collins was portrayed in the British press at the time. And I think that this film captured this attention vividly, because it shows Collins in London surrounded by photographers and journalists, whilst also portraying the growing legend of him back at home. So there's one scene in the film where he enters a cafe in Dublin and a waitress asks if he's really Michael Collins. And she remarks that her father will be jealous, you know, that she got to meet Michael Collins. I think that when portraying major historical figures on TV or in film, there's always a danger, perhaps of lapsing into caricature, especially with well-known historical figures. Collins and Lloyd George are presented as genuinely three-dimensional characters. So there's one scene in the film that highlights Collins' more intellectual side. There's a thing where he sits for a portrait for John Lavery, the artist, and he remarks that he's never missed a George Bernard Shaw play, referring to the time when he lived in London in his youth. He also mentions having read Shaw extensively, and we kind of see John Lavery's surprise here. So yeah, I think it tries to portray different sides to Collins, not just the military side. In terms of other figures portrayed, Cathal Brugha, the Dáil Minister for Defence, I would say that he's portrayed in a more balanced way than in the 1996 Michael Collins film, for instance. In recent years, there's been more scholarship on Brugha. So there's one book, Cathal Brugha, An Indomitable Spirit by Gerard Hanley. So it was published in 2022, and it kind of challenged the more simplistic and reductive depiction of Brugha as a militant. So I'd say arguably he's portrayed in a slightly more balanced way in this film, although obviously still very passionate in terms of his beliefs, of course. So there are, however, still some criticisms to be made about the film. I think one obvious one is it's heavy on dialogue, and I think that's to be expected given the topic of the film. There's also some deviations from the historical record. Collins' fiancée, Kitty Kiernan, is not mentioned. Moreover, in the scene preceding Collins' supposed first meeting with Lady Lavery, it's implied he's not in a serious relationship. And when one of the delegation secretaries tells Collins, I hear you're well spoken for, he kind of replies, don't believe all that you read, which obviously wasn't accurate at that time. Again, it's typical of made-for-TV productions at that time in terms of its lower budget. So yeah, that's basically some of the criticisms. So as I mentioned earlier, I think when most people are asked to name a Michael Collins film, they're instinctively going to think of the 1996 Hollywood biopic Michael Collins, directed by Neil Jordan and produced by Warner Brothers. The film boasted an all-star cast. It featured Liam Neeson as Collins, Alan Rickman as Dee Valera, and Julia Roberts portraying Kitty Kiernan. So in some ways, the comparisons are unavoidable, but it's worth remembering that there were two very different productions with different scripts. The Treaty was a made-for-television drama documentary of sorts, and its budget was between 850,000 and 900,000 estimated. Whereas Neil Jordan's Michael Collins cost around $28 million. So it's a very fast difference in the budget. It was a Hollywood movie, and it was obviously intended for a wide cinema release. The Treaty film, it focuses on the autumn 1921 negotiations and the lead up to them. Neil Jordan's film focuses on Collins' life from 1916, so it starts with Easter Rising and up until his death in 1922. Neil Jordan's film cuts out scenes negotiating the treaty in London, but it does portray the treaty debates in the Dáil, which are obviously very heated. There might be a tendency for people to compare Brendan Gleeson's portrayal of Collins with that of Liam Neeson. Some have argued that Gleeson's more low-key portrayal of Collins is more authentic. I think it's fair to say Gleeson bore a more striking physical resemblance to Collins. He was closer to Collins' age at his time of portraying it. Nevertheless, both Neeson and Gleeson, they bring different things to the role, and they worked with the script they'd had, and they both deliver fine performances. Just as an interesting piece of trivia, Brendan Gleeson actually appeared as well in the 1996 Michael Collins film, so there's actually some crossover. It was a minor role, but he played Liam Tobin, who's an intelligence officer, a major general, and he was actually one of Collins' most trusted lieutenants. As I mentioned earlier, the treaty does contain some historical inaccuracies. However, I think when you compare it to Neil Jordan's film, which is, as I said, made for Hollywood audiences, it's generally regarded as a more accurate portrayal of events. Jordan's film, while powerful and emotionally resonant, takes greater dramatic liberties, I would say. And based on conversations I've had with historians and members of the public, I think generally the consensus is that the treaty offers a more faithful and nuanced depiction of events. Obviously, both films were released different dates. Released in 1991, the treaty preceded Neil Jordan's Michael Collins, which came in 1996. And actually, Warner Brothers only agreed to finance Jordan's film following the IRA ceasefire in 1994, reflecting the shifting political climate. Viewers noted that Michael Collins drew more overt parallels to the Northern Ireland Troubles, with historian Paul Bew even compared Collins' journey to that of a contemporary political figure. Both films are in no way shaped and reflected public discourse around violence, compromise, and perhaps the price of peace. Jordan's film, with its emotional pull and broader international reach, also sparked more controversy, I would say, and public debate. The treaty was rescreened on RTE in December 1996, shortly after the release of the Michael Collins film. However, unlike Neil Jordan's biopic, it's rarely been broadcast on TV since. Many viewers continue to hope that it will be reshown on TV. The fact that no official DVD has been released has helped contribute towards its relative obscurity. So thank you so much for taking the time to listen to my talk. I really appreciate it. I hope you find it enjoyable. If you haven't seen the film yet, I'd highly recommend watching it, especially if you have an interest in Irish history or British history or political drama, or if you're interested in any of the key figures historically, like Michael Collins, Dee Valera, I'd recommend watching it. It's available on YouTube, because I've often been asked when I've been discussing that, is it available anywhere? Because I know it can be hard to get. So yes, it is available on YouTube if you want to watch the whole film. So as a researcher and a historian, just to say, I've published a number of articles over the years on Michael Collins and on other key figures from the Irish Revolutionary period. So if you'd like to stay updated with my work, I've just put a couple of details there on the screen. You can follow me on Twitter, where I'm quite active, and just leave my email address there. So you're welcome to get in touch by email or on social media if you're ever interested in a talk or collaboration or anything like that. So that's me. Thanks again.
Thanks very much, Alison. That was honestly brilliant. And I'm sure a lot of people will find that enjoyable, not just the areas you mentioned, like Irish history, British history and stuff, but people may be just interested in Brendan Gleeson, for example. And one of the interesting things that came from it for me was I did not know that he was a teacher before an actor.
Yeah, so, I think it was interesting because when I was like, people thinking of Brendan Gleeson like in present day, if you know what I mean. He's a very, very established actor. He's appeared in all sorts of films. He's very high profile, but yeah, at that stage, he'd come into acting, I believe, a bit later in life professionally. Like I think he'd been in theatre and stuff. So I think, yeah, that would have been one of his earlier kind of works that helped him, I'd say, to gain prominence. So he definitely wouldn't have been as well known then, you know. So it's interesting, yeah.
It is very interesting, and this probably sounds a very stupid question because the Irish Revolutionary period, and Irish history in general is so interesting. But what got you interested in your area of expertise, so to speak?
I think like when I was at secondary school, I started to become more interested in Irish history. But I'd say like in sixth form and that sort of thing, it was probably more like an overview alongside other topics like Second World War and things. But like looking at things like the Easter Rising or like the Anglo-Irish Treaty, kind of like an overview. So I think I started to become interested, and then obviously I attended Queen's doing a joint degree in history undergrad. So I think a lot of it developed from there, just doing like different modules, you know, on Irish history. And then I did a module in third year on kind of the Irish Revolution. So I think, yeah, even sort of like after I'd done my master's degree and stuff. So that was 2014, I graduated, but then coming up to 2016, it was kind of like the centenary of the Easter Rising, stuff like that. And I know there's a lot of very well-known scholars sort of like teaching at Queen's and stuff, and maybe they had kind of an influence on shaping my interest as well, to be fair, you know.
No, as I say, it's absolutely love Irish history. And I'm sure there's a vast amount of people who does. And I know people who'll be watching this video will find this very interesting. So thanks for much. But one more question just for me. Is there any other areas of history or any other particular figure within this period that you're going to be looking at or you aspire to look at in the future?
I think like there's not one in particular I can kind of name now, because I think it's there's so many, you know, to choose from. But I think like in the past I've written quite a lot about, like, I like to look at the lesser known figures in Irish history, and I've written a lot of short articles for Ireland's Own as well, just to mention, over the years. And I think what's been interesting for me is there's a lot of figures out there who you wouldn't have heard of. Like Cathal Brugha had a brother, Alfred, and I'd written about him, and he'd worked for Dublin Corporation, he'd worked in engineering and stuff. And like, if you read like his Bureau of Military History witness statement and stuff, he'd been in the volunteers for a while, although he didn't take part in the Rising. But it's interesting sometimes to look at lesser known family members or think, maybe why did one of them become more politically radicalized? Maybe another one had kind of this similar family background, but maybe led a more traditional life and career.
Exactly.
But yeah, and like I've written about a lot of maybe lesser known women in history as well, you know, because like Dee Fowler's wife, Sinead as well. She's a very interesting figure on her own, because I think sometimes it can be that tendency to get kind of they get pushed to the background and looking at having a more famous, you know, family member. But she had kind of aspired to be an actress when she was younger. She'd met Dee Fowler when she was teaching. She had a teaching career. She taught Irish language. She also wrote a lot of like fairy tales, children's books and stuff later on. So I think there's a lot of figures that we need to kind of put in more prominent positions. So I think I definitely like to do more of that, you know, going forward with my work in the future and build on that.
100%. And just for people's own interest and stuff, as I say, check out Alison's work on those various. I know she supplied her email and stuff and her Twitter, so definitely check that out. But also check out her work on Ireland's own history, Ireland and Shorelat and stuff. And she also has written a blog for my website as well on the Uncharted Past. So definitely give that a read. It's an amazing read as well. It actually, the last time I checked it, there was over like 3,000 views or something, reads on the website. So yeah, definitely check that out. But yeah, just wanted to say thanks so much to Alison for an amazing talk today. It was honestly so interesting, and I'm sure a lot of you will agree watching this. And if there's any other historians, scholars of any other fields, disciplines, who has a history tale or story to tell on whatever topic, just get in touch with me and I'll get this up as soon as possible. And just to finish as well, this video, if you prefer to listen to your history, will also be available as a podcast on Amazon Music and Spotify. So definitely check that out as well. But yeah, once again, folks, thanks very much to Alison, and I'll see you next time for more talk on history. Bye bye.